The village of St. Mary Mead was, as usual, peaceful on that late afternoon in early summer. The village, with its patchwork of cobbled streets, ivy-covered cottages, and overgrown hedgerows, was the sort of place where news traveled slowly and gossip moved even slower. For generations, the villagers had lived in relative harmony, their daily lives marked by the mundane routines of farming, church-going, and the occasional village fete. But there was an undercurrent to this idyllic village, a hidden undercurrent. Few could see, and even fewer could understand. Chapter 01. On this particular Saturday afternoon, however, there was an air of excitement that hung like a soft fog over St. Mary Mead. The village's annual garden party was being held at the grand home of Mrs. Violet Darby, one of the most prominent and most talked about women in the village. The house, a sprawling Victorian manor, stood at the top of a gentle hill that overlooked the rest of the village. It was the sort of house that demanded attention, not just because of its size and grandiosity, but because it symbolized the status and wealth that Mrs. Darby had worked hard to attain in her long years of social climbing. The garden party was a yearly tradition, one where the village's most influential and wealthy individuals gathered to network, gossip, and exchange pleasantries. Mrs. Darby, with her perfectly coiffed hair and exquisite taste in fashion, took great pride in hosting these events. She had spared no expense for this year's affair, ensuring that every detail was flawless, from the perfectly manicured flower beds that surrounded her sprawling garden to the delicate porcelain tea sets that were laid out under the shade of the sprawling oak tree. A string quartet had been hired to play soft, lilting melodies, and the scent of blooming roses filled the air, mingling with the soft, musky smell of fresh earth and grass. Among the guests that afternoon was Miss Jane Marple, a retired spinster with a reputation for being a quiet observer of human nature. She had lived in St. Mary Mead for as long as anyone could remember, though she had always managed to stay in the background, content to remain unnoticed at most social gatherings. Miss Marple, however, was far from ordinary. Beneath her unassuming appearance, her soft, silver hair pulled back into a neat bun, her mild blue eyes that often appeared distant lay a mind that was razor sharp. She had spent her life studying people, watching their every move, listening to the way they spoke, and understanding the small, seemingly insignificant things that others often overlooked. As Miss Marple sipped her tea, she glanced around the party, her eyes briefly meeting the gaze of Mrs. Darby, who was floating from guest to guest, her face beaming with satisfaction. Mrs. Darby was engaged in a lively conversation with Reverend Beecham, who stood stiffly, his collar uncomfortably tight. As always, Miss Lavinia Cutts, a rather prim and proper old lady, was gossiping animatedly with Helen Summers, the village's most sought-after young woman. Helen, in her perfectly pressed summer dress, was far more interested in her own reflection in the garden's mirror-like pond than in the conversation at hand. As usual, the scene was one of polite indifference and social maneuvering, as everyone tried to appear their best. For Miss Marple, this was all par for the course. She had seen it all before. She had spent countless hours in the company of villagers who were more concerned with appearances than with anything of substance. But even so, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the subtleties of the interactions around her. The way Mrs. Darby's smile faded just a little when she spoke to Reverend Beecham. The nervous twitch in Miss Cutts's eye when Helen laughed too loudly. The way Helen's fingers lingered a little too long on the handle of her teacup, as if she were hoping for something more than just idle conversation. Miss Marple made mental notes of each detail. Nothing escaped her notice. It was then that the scream came, sound so sharp, so unexpected, that it froze the entire garden. The high-pitched cry came from the back of the property, near the well, where some of the guests had gathered to enjoy the cool shade. Miss Marple, ever the observer, was the first to move. She stood up, her eyes narrowing as she instinctively followed the direction of the scream. Her thoughts were already working in overdrive, analyzing the possibilities, the potential motivations. By the time the rest of the guests had fully registered what had happened, Miss Marple was already approaching the group by the well. The first sight that greeted her was that of Mrs. Darby, her face an unnatural shade of pale, her eyes wide with horror. She was trembling, her hand pressed to her mouth as she stared down into the well, and there, lying at the bottom, was the lifeless body of Margaret Claiborne, Mrs. Darby's niece. Margaret had arrived the day before for a weekend visit, her youthful energy and beauty immediately making her the subject of many a conversation at the party. But now, her body lay twisted, her face frozen in a grimace of terror, her delicate hands still clutching at the cold stone of the well's edge. The guests reacted in various ways. Mrs. Darby, of course, was in a state of shock, unable to even speak. The Reverend, ever the man of duty, immediately began barking orders, though his hands shook noticeably as he tried to maintain some semblance of control. Miss Cutts was muttering something about needing to call the police, though her voice was barely audible over the commotion. Helen Summers stood at the back of the group, her face pale, her hand pressed to her mouth as she stared at the body. Sergeant Collingwood, the village constable, arrived soon after. The large, unshaven man had a tendency to bumble through situations, his awkward movements and lack of real authority often making matters worse. He waddled toward the well, his hands on his hips, trying to take in the scene. His voice, however, did little to calm the situation. "Everyone, stay back. We'll sort this out, okay? The police will be here soon." Miss Marple, who had been standing to the side, watching the flurry of activity with her customary composure, took a deep breath and walked forward. She had already noticed a few key details. The way Margaret's body had fallen there was something off about it. A fall into the well wouldn't have left her body in such a position. There was no sign of struggle, no indication that Margaret had been accidentally pushed. And there was something else, something Miss Marple couldn't quite place about. The look on Mrs. Darby's face. Miss Marple's mind worked quickly, her thoughts already beginning to piece together the puzzle. Something didn't fit. This wasn't a simple accident, and it certainly wasn't a suicide. No, there was more at play here. She would be the one to unravel it. As the constable fumbled with his instructions, Miss Marple quietly observed the guests' reactions. Each person responded differently, but it was clear to her that everyone was hiding something. A quiet suspicion bloomed in her chest. The small-town secrets that everyone had kept behind closed doors were about to be revealed, whether they liked it or not. The villagers, of course, would believe it was an accident, but Miss Marple knew better. She had seen it before, and soon she would see it again. The sound of sirens broke the stillness of the village, the distant wail growing louder as the police arrived to take control of the scene. Constable Collingwood, despite his obvious discomfort and lack of authority, took it upon himself to cordon off the area, ushering the guests away from the well with a series of poorly delivered commands. The once lively garden party had descended into an uncomfortable gathering of uneasy villagers, all of them standing in small, tense clusters, casting furtive glances toward the well as though it held some sinister mystery within its depths. Miss Marple, ever observant, remained to the side, unnoticed amidst the general flurry of activity. She allowed the constable to take charge, though her mind was already working. She had seen how the villagers reacted, each of them displaying the familiar signs of discomfort, confusion, and suspicion, but none of them truly acknowledging the weight of what had just transpired. There was something troubling about the ease with which they accepted the situation, as if death in the village was something they could dismiss with a few muttered words of condolence. Mrs. Darby was still frozen near the well, her hand clutching her chest as though her breath had been stolen away. Her face was pale, her usual composure shattered. She seemed almost unaware of the constable's attempts to reassure her, her attention fixed entirely on the body below. Miss Marple noted this. There was something peculiar in Mrs. Darby's reaction, a faint unease that had yet to be fully expressed. She had known the woman for many years, and this sudden display of vulnerability felt oddly out of place for the woman who had always prided herself on controlling every aspect of her life. The Reverend Beecham, who had earlier been engaged in conversation with Mrs. Darby, now stood stiffly beside her. His usual air of self-righteousness had given way to a kind of solemn detachment. His gaze flitted between the body and the constable, as though he were merely a spectator in this unfortunate drama, rather than someone who might possess any deeper understanding of the situation. "Margaret," Mrs. Darby whispered, her voice barely audible over the commotion. "Margaret, my poor dear, my poor dear." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she observed Mrs. Darby's mournful tone. It was too rehearsed, too controlled. It seemed almost as though the grief was being performed rather than felt. Hush. In her many years of observing people, Miss Marple had learned to detect the subtle nuances in their behavior, the slightest hints that revealed the truth beneath the surface. And Mrs. Darby's display of emotion was far from convincing. Nearby, Miss Cutts was already launching into a theory, her voice rising above the murmurs of the crowd. "I'm sure it was an accident," she said in a shrill voice, her eyes wide with exaggerated concern. "The poor girl must have been careless, leaning too far over the edge of the well. It's tragic, but we mustn't jump to conclusions." Marple listened intently, her attention now turning to Miss Cutts. The elderly woman had lived in St. Mary Mead for decades, and while she was often regarded as the village gossip, Miss Marple knew her better than most. She knew that Miss Cutts, while well-meaning, had a tendency to fabricate stories, especially in moments of crisis. Her response, like the others, was too quick, too eager to settle the matter without truly understanding what had happened. "I agree," Reverend Beecham added, his voice full of authority. "Accidents happen, especially when people are careless or distracted, but it's no use speculating until we know more. The police will sort it out." Miss Cutts nodded emphatically, as though this sudden death were nothing more than a minor inconvenience that would soon be forgotten. The villagers, still uneasy, murmured their agreement. Some began to turn away, returning to their original places, though their faces remained tense and uncertain. The conversation around the well died down, leaving only the faintest echoes of suspicion hanging in the air. But not everyone was so quick to dismiss the situation. Miss Marple remained still, observing the scene with quiet intensity. The villagers may have been eager to push the incident aside, but she could feel something beneath the surface, something that tugged at her instincts, something she had yet to put into words. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that the death of Margaret Claiborne was no accident. There was something more to it, something that none of the villagers were willing to see. The constable had now called for the arrival of the local detectives, but it was clear that no one was particularly concerned with the details of the case just yet. The death of a young woman in a well, after all, wasn't exactly rare in a place like St. Mary Mead. No, the villagers were already beginning to move on, content to chalk it up to a tragic misstep, rather than face the unsettling possibility that one of their own might be involved. Miss Marple, however, was not so easily swayed. She had already begun to piece together the tiniest of details that others had missed. The way Mrs. Darby had looked away when she spoke about her niece's death, the way Reverend Beecham had been oddly calm, and the way Miss Cutts had jumped to conclusions without truly knowing anything. All of these small clues whispered to Miss Marple that there was more to the story. She watched as the constable fumbled with his instructions, trying in vain to calm the remaining guests. He was out of his depth, as always, but Miss Marple could see that his attempts to control the situation were merely making things worse. The villagers were anxious, casting sidelong glances at one another, wondering who would be the first to speak. They wanted answers, but no one was willing to ask the right questions as the sun began to dip lower in the sky. Casting long shadows over the garden, Miss Marple stood still, lost in thought. She was aware of the whispers around her, the murmurs of confusion and unease, but none of that mattered. What mattered was the quiet, unspoken truth that was beginning to take shape in her mind, a truth that would require careful observation, subtle questioning, and a great deal of patience to uncover. She turned her attention back to Mrs. Darby, who was now seated on the bench nearby, her head bowed in apparent sorrow. Miss Marple's gaze softened for a moment, her instincts telling her that Mrs. Darby was hiding something, and she knew, deep down, that it would be this woman who held the key to unlocking the mystery. The constable had managed to organize the guests into small groups, but Miss Marple had little interest in speaking to them just yet. Instead, she made her way toward the edge of the garden, where a small bench offered a better view of the scene. She needed time to think, time to piece together the fragments of the puzzle. This was no accident. Someone here had a motive, and Miss Marple would not rest until she discovered who that was. Her mind continued to work, quietly and methodically, as the village slowly began to return to its former state of uneasy calm. The mystery had only just begun, and Miss Marple, as always, would be the one to unravel it. Chapter 02. The evening wore on, and as the shadows stretched longer across the village, the garden party's festive air had been replaced by an oppressive silence. The villagers, once eager to gossip and socialize, had retreated into groups of quiet speculation. The teacups remained abandoned, the delicate pastries untouched. As the conversation swirled around the tragic death of Margaret Claiborne, Miss Marple, however, had made no attempt to engage in the hushed murmurs. She had long ago learned that the key to understanding human nature lay not in what people said, but in how they behaved when they thought no one was looking. The constable had done his best to take charge, but it was clear that he was out of his depth. As he fumbled through his notes, trying to organize the scene, Miss Marple could hear the sounds of nearby conversations. "I do hope it was an accident." Miss Cutts's voice cut through the murmur of the crowd. "But surely we should wait for the proper authorities. I mean, a poor girl, all alone, ... Who knows what happened?" Reverend Beecham, standing near Mrs. Darby, offered a quiet nod, but his gaze was distant, his posture stiff. "It's best we leave it to the police," he muttered, as though he had already passed judgment. Miss Marple, taking no notice of these exchanges, turned her attention back to the scene. The well, which had once been a peaceful spot in the garden, now stood as a grim monument to the young woman's untimely death. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. There was a stillness in the air, as though the garden itself were holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable conclusion to unfold. The police arrived shortly after, a trio of officers who quickly took charge, pushing back the curious crowd and turning their attention to the well. They began to cordon off the area, marking the perimeter with yellow tape. The officers looked as though they had dealt with their fair share of small-town mishaps, but this was different. They were cautious, glancing nervously at one another. As they began their preliminary investigation, Miss Marple, noticing that the officers were focusing their attention on the scene without speaking to the guests, quietly made her way toward the house. She had a few things to observe, and she wasn't about to allow the chaos to distract her from the real work. Inside the house, Mrs. Darby was seated in the parlor, her expression more composed than it had been earlier, but still far from her usual self. Miss Marple hesitated at the threshold of the room, her mind swirling with the questions that had yet to be answered. Mrs. Darby looked up when she noticed her visitor was offering a weak smile. "Miss Marple," she said softly, I don't know what to think. Poor Margaret. She was so full of life, so full of promise. How could something like this happen? Miss Marple took a seat across from her gaze lingering for a moment on the older woman's features. Mrs. Darby's eyes were red-rimmed, her hands trembling slightly as they rested in her lap. It was easy to see the woman was distraught. Miss Marple wasn't one to take appearances at face value. "I'm sure this is difficult for you," Miss Marple began gently, "but if you could tell me what happened just before the tragedy. Was Margaret near the well? Did anyone see her?" Mrs. Darby's face twitched, a brief flicker of uncertainty crossing her features before she forced a smile. "She was near the well. Yes, she often wandered off on her own. You know, Margaret had such an independent spirit. But it's so strange. I didn't see her go to the well. I only noticed when the others started to scream." Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. There was something off about Mrs. Darby's account. The story was too vague, too rehearsed. It was clear to Miss Marple that the woman was holding something back. "I see," Miss Marple said softly, not pressing further just yet. "And tell me, Mrs. Darby, was there anyone in particular who had a close relationship with Margaret? Perhaps someone who might have been upset with her, or had reason to quarrel?" Mrs. Darby shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Margaret had friends, of course. She was always so lively, so charming. But I suppose there were a few people who didn't always get along with her, but I really can't say anything specific. It was such a harmless village. Everyone knows everyone's business. Business." Miss Marple's sharp gaze didn't miss the way Mrs. Darby's hands fluttered nervously at the mention of conflict. It was a subtle reaction, but to Miss Marple, it spoke volumes. She could almost see the hidden layers of the woman's emotions, the carefully constructed facade that Mrs. Darby was attempting to maintain. But something in the way she spoke hinted that there was far more to the situation than the elderly woman was letting on. "I understand," Miss Marple said, her voice as gentle as ever. "Thank you for your time, Mrs. Darby. I'm sure the police will find answers soon enough." Mrs. Darby nodded, her eyes momentarily distant. Yes, I hope so too. I can't bear to think of what might have happened. Poor Margaret." Miss Marple rose from her seat, her eyes lingering on Mrs. Darby for a moment longer before she turned and left the room. As she made her way back to the front of the house, she couldn't help but feel the nagging pull of her instincts. T had learned long ago to trust those instincts, and they were telling her that something wasn't right. The vague explanations, the nervous tics, everything pointed to a mystery that had yet to be fully uncovered. Outside, the police had begun their investigation, but they were more focused on the physical aspects of the scene than on the human element, the small, subtle details that spoke of hidden motives and unspoken truths. Miss Marple, however, knew that the key to solving this lay in understanding the people involved, not just the circumstances. She took a moment to watch the officers as they moved about, talking to the remaining guests and taking statements. Constable appeared overwhelmed, but there was something in his demeanor that told her he wasn't nearly as invested in the case as he should have been. Miss Marple observed him carefully, noting how his eyes darted around the scene as though he were unsure of what to do next. But it wasn't his confusion that interested her, it was his lack of urgency, the slight impatience in his movements that suggested he was already looking for an easy explanation to end the matter. A theory began to form in Miss Marple's mind, one based on the human elements of the case. She knew that someone among the villagers had a secret to hide, and it was only a matter of time before the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the garden, Miss Marple turned her attention back to the guests, watching them closely. She had a sense that this was only the beginning, and she would need to be patient as she gathered the pieces. One thing was certain: the truth, whatever it might be, was hidden behind the closed doors of St. Mary Mead, and Miss Marple would be the one to unlock it. The evening darkened, and the tension in the air seemed to thicken with each passing minute. By now, the garden was quiet once more, save for the hum of whispered conversations and the occasional rustle of leaves stirred by the evening breeze. The guests had begun to disperse, most of them having left the premises under the guise of respecting the investigation. However, Miss Marple knew better than to believe that the mystery had been so easily resolved. But the real investigation, in her eyes, had only just begun. Miss Marple had stayed behind, as she often did in such circumstances, to observe. She had seen people at their best and their worst, and tonight she was watching them at their most vulnerable. There was something inherently telling about the way they interacted now, in the aftermath of the tragedy. In these moments, the cracks in their facades were beginning to show. The village's carefully constructed veneer of civility was starting to crumble, revealing secrets that none of them had planned to share. The constable, whose name was seemingly forgotten in the frenzy of activity, had retreated to his small office to file his preliminary report, leaving the remaining officers to continue their investigation. The scene was not quite as chaotic as it had been earlier, but the air was thick with the weight of the unknown. The villagers had resumed their hushed conversations, but they spoke in softer tones now, as if afraid their words would carry too far. Miss Marple took a moment to scan the group from a distance. Mrs. Darby had withdrawn to the corner of the garden, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her gaze lost in the distance. She looked far older than she had just hours ago, as though the shock of the death had taken something out of her. Miss Cutts, the village gossip, was speaking in low tones to Miss Summers, her voice tight with worry. Helen, for her part, seemed to be entirely absorbed in the conversation, though her eyes darted occasionally toward the well, her expression unreadable. Reverend Beecham had withdrawn to a quiet corner of the garden, where he now stood, deep in thought. His face remained impassive, but Miss Marple noticed the way his fingers twitched slightly, betraying the tension in his usually composed demeanor. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, but Miss Marple knew she had to be careful. Every word spoken, every gesture made, carried meaning, and it was in the subtle details that the truth would reveal itself. She had learned long ago that the truth was often more easily hidden than found, and that sometimes it was the most unexpected individuals who held the key to solving a mystery. The first of the obvious suspects, Miss Cutts, had already revealed herself to be someone of interest. Her hasty explanations earlier, too eager to offer a simple conclusion, had struck Miss Marple as suspicious. In fact, it seemed as though Miss Cutts had been more concerned with maintaining the peace than with uncovering the truth. She was the kind of person who, when faced with uncertainty, would rather provide a false sense of order than risk confronting a difficult truth. The way she had spoken of Margaret's death, suggesting that it was an accident before the facts were even known, spoke volumes. It was as though she wanted the mystery to be tidily wrapped up as quickly as possible, without raising any uncomfortable questions. Miss Marple's suspicions grew as she observed Miss Cutts and Helen Summers. The two women had grown quiet after their initial conversation, but their proximity to one another made Miss Marple wonder whether their alliance was one of convenience or something deeper. Helen, it seemed, had been the closest to Margaret, and her demeanor now was unlike anything Miss Marple had seen before. There was no visible grief in her posture, no sign of shock or sorrow. Instead, Helen appeared almost detached, her expression unreadable, as if she were already stepping out of the emotional reality of the situation, distancing herself from the tragedy before it even fully sank in. Helen's gaze flickered toward the group of men standing near the entrance, including Reverend Beecham. The tension in her gaze, Miss Marple noticed, seemed to suggest more than just idle curiosity. There was something calculating in the way Helen looked at him, a subtle, almost imperceptible narrowing of her eyes. It was clear to Miss Marple that Helen and Beecham had some history, and it wasn't the kind of history that could be easily explained away. The Reverend, who had previously been so stoic in the face of the tragedy, was now deep in conversation with one of the officers. His brow furrowed as though he were contemplating something far more pressing than a simple accident. Miss Marple made her way over to the small group of officers gathered near the well, but they were discussing the next steps in the investigation. The constable had now returned, his face drawn with fatigue, but there was no sign of the initial urgency that had marked his earlier actions. It was as if the matter was already in hand, the death of Margaret Claiborne already reduced to a footnote in the village's long history of quiet misfortune. But Miss Marple knew better. She had seen too many cases where the truth was buried beneath layers of assumption, and she was determined not to let that happen here. "Good evening, Constable," she said, her voice calm but firm. She waited until he looked up from his notes, then added, "I trust you've made some progress in your investigation." The constable's expression shifted slightly, as though he was surprised to see Miss Marple standing there. It was as if, in his mind, she was still the harmless old spinster who kept to herself, not the astute observer of human nature that she truly was. He cleared his throat before answering. "We've spoken with most of the guests," he said, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "Okay, but so far, there's not much to go on. Mrs. Darby insists it was an accident, okay, and most of the others are too rattled to give any solid details. We've got no reason to believe foul play was involved, but we're still waiting on the coroner's report." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes flickering toward the well again. "I understand, but I must say, Constable, there's something about the situation that doesn't sit right with me." The constable's eyebrows furrowed slightly, though he didn't respond immediately. Miss Marple continued, her voice quiet but intense. "Have you spoken to the others yet? Mrs. Darby seems quite shaken, but there's something odd about the way she's handling the situation, okay? And Miss Cutswell, she was far too eager to call it an accident, okay? I wonder if perhaps she knows more than she's letting on." The constable blinked, his expression wary. "What are you suggesting, Miss Marple?" "I'm suggesting," she said slowly, "that there's more to this than meets the eye. The villagers are all too eager to put this to rest. Perhaps they fear what might come to light if they dig a little deeper." With that, Miss Marple turned away, leaving the constable to ponder her words. She knew that now, more than ever, the mystery had truly begun. The investigation was just starting, and the suspects, though they appeared innocent enough, were already starting to reveal themselves. As Miss Marple walked slowly back toward the house, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was getting closer to the truth. Each of the villagers had something to hide, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover it. The game had begun in earnest, and she was ready to play her part. Chapter 3. The morning light filtered through the curtains of the small parlor where Miss Marple sat, still mulling over the events of the previous evening. The village was quiet once more, the gentle hum of daily life resuming as though nothing had changed. But Miss Marple knew that something had changed, something invisible, and yet profoundly disruptive. The death of Margaret Claiborne had cast a long shadow over the village, and Miss Marple's instincts were telling her that the case was far from a simple accident, as so many wanted to believe. Miss Marple had spent the early hours of the morning walking through the village, reflecting on the quiet whispers of last night. Every conversation, every half-spoken word had carried meaning, but it wasn't the obvious suspects, like Miss Cutts or Reverend Beecham, that intrigued her. Most hit was something far subtler, something hidden beneath the surface. She needed to understand the village, its people, and their motives more deeply, for it was there, in the crevices of their lives, that she would find the truth. She had observed a particularly telling moment last night. Just after the police had arrived, Mrs. Darby, still seated on the bench, had looked at the well. For a long time, her eyes glazed and unfocused. The others had been caught up in their own distress, but Miss Marple's attention had been drawn to the older woman. It wasn't grief that clouded Mrs. Darby's eyes, it was fear. Tarbine's, Sidney Harple's trained eye had caught the brief flicker of something more dangerous, something that lurked just beneath the surface of her well-manicured persona. Despite her outward appearance of control, Mrs. Darby had a history of managing situations with manipulation and subtlety, and Miss Marple suspected she wasn't as broken by her niece's death as she let on. She had been careful not to press her, but the small, unguarded moments had spoken volumes. As Miss Marple reviewed this, a crucial thought entered her mind. If Margaret's death wasn't an accident, then who stood to gain from her being gone? The clock in the room chimed softly, interrupting her musings. Miss Marple stood and walked to the window, her gaze falling on the sprawling garden outside. She knew that the next step in her investigation lay in the details, the small things that others overlooked. Last night, something had stood out to her, fleeting moment, a single, seemingly insignificant detail that had been discarded by everyone else. The well had been central to the tragedy, and while the police were focusing on the obvious evidence of the body, the apparent fall, Miss Marple knew there was more to the story than just a simple slip. The key, she suspected, was hidden in plain sight. She returned to the scene that morning, taking care to observe the garden more closely, now that the police had finished their initial sweep. The well, the center of the tragedy, stood eerily still, its stone walls weathered and covered with ivy. The morning fog still clung to the air, casting a quiet pall over the area. Miss Marple had already walked around the perimeter of the well once, but there had been something she had missed during the chaos of the night. As she examined the area with a more focused eye, her gaze was drawn to the ground just beside the well. There, half hidden under a patch of tangled grass, was something glinting in the morning light. Small object, almost too tiny to notice at first, but something that caught Miss Marple's attention instantly. She knelt down and carefully brushed the grass aside to reveal what appeared to be a small, delicate silver locket. It wasn't much a trinket, a small piece of jewelry, but to Miss Marple, it was more than enough to raise questions. The locket was far too small to be Margaret's. She had always worn her jewelry modestly, nothing as ornate as this. Miss Marple turned the locket over in her hands, noticing that there was no engraving, no inscription that might identify its owner. The edges were worn, as if it had been handled many times. And there was a faint, lingering scent of perfume. Her mind raced. Who did this locket belong to? It seemed out of place, almost to personal land. Miss Marple knew that such a small, seemingly trivial detail could often hold the key to unraveling a much larger mystery. She slipped the locket into her pocket carefully, making sure not to disturb the ground any further. She would need to get it examined, but for now, it was enough to know that it had been dropped there for a reason, and that reason was something Miss Marple intended to uncover. As she stood up, brushing the grass from her skirts, she noticed movement from the corner of her eye. A figure was approaching, walking steadily toward her. It was Mrs. Darby, her face drawn and tired, though still holding onto that well-practiced composure that had so impressed the villagers for years. Miss Marple straightened, smoothing out her clothes, and waited for the older woman to arrive. Miss Marple, Mrs. Darby said softly, her voice carrying a note of weariness. I thought I might find you here. Miss Marple nodded, her expression neutral. I'm just taking a walk through the garden. The morning light helps clear the mind, doesn't it? Mrs. Darby didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stepped closer, her gaze shifting toward the well. There was a tightness in her posture now, a subtle unease that Miss Marple had not seen the evening before. Mrs. Darby's eyes flitted briefly toward the spot where Miss Marple had found a locket, but she quickly looked away. I wanted to thank you for your kindness last night, Mrs. Darby continued. her voice still trembling slightly. "I didn't expect you to stay so long, but I appreciate it. You've been a great help in keeping the others calm." Miss Marple smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I do my best to help when I can, but I'm afraid I don't understand why you were so certain it was an accident, Mrs. Darby. Surely you must have some concerns. Terrell, your niece's death was so sudden, so unexpected." Mrs. Darby stiffened at the mention of her niece. "What do you mean? You think I might be hiding something? What exactly do you think happened?" Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, choosing her words carefully. "I don't know, Mrs. Darby, but I do know that people aren't always as they seem. And sometimes the smallest details can reveal the largest truths." Mrs. Darby's gaze wavered, and for a brief moment, Miss Marple saw a flash of something darker in her eyes, flicker of fear, perhaps, or something else entirely. It was gone as quickly as it had come, but it told Miss Marple everything she needed to know. Mrs. Darby was hiding something. She was not as innocent as she appeared. "I believe," Miss Marple said softly, her tone measured, "that it's time we all took a closer look at the people around us. The truth is rarely where we expect to find it." Mrs. Darby didn't respond, but her silence spoke volumes. She turned abruptly and began to walk back toward the house, leaving Miss Marple standing alone once more. Miss Marple stood there for a moment, her mind racing. The locket had been important, but there was something more at play, here, a deeper layer to the story that no one else had yet seen. Mrs. Darby had known more than she was letting on, and the people closest to her were just as likely to be involved. This case was far from over, and Miss Marple knew that every small piece of the puzzle would need to be carefully examined. Only then would the truth begin to surface. With a quiet resolve, Miss Marple turned back toward the house, ready to continue her investigation. The game, she knew, was far from over. The day was slipping toward late afternoon, and a chilly breeze swept through the village, carrying with it the scent of impending rain. The sun, once bright and cheerful, had been obscured by heavy clouds that now loomed over the peaceful garden. Miss Marple, standing in the quiet solitude of the garden, allowed the stillness to settle around her. Her mind was alive with thoughts, each piece of the puzzle she had begun to gather, slowly falling into place. She had seen something in Mrs. Darby's eyes, something that had disturbed her more than she had anticipated. This was the kind of fear that was rooted in guilt, the kind of fear that arose when someone had too much to lose. Miss Marple had learned long ago to trust such instincts, and she had no intention of letting this moment pass without further exploration. There were secrets buried beneath the surface of St. Mary Mead in Mrs. Darby, for all her charm and elegance was at the heart of it. The locket was still tucked safely in Miss Marple's pocket, and she hadn't yet had a chance to speak to anyone about it. She needed more answers, more context, and she knew that the time had come to confront those who had been closest to Margaret. It was not an accident, she was certain of that now, but the question remained, who had killed Margaret, and why? As Miss Marple approached the house once more, she saw that the constable was now standing near the front door, speaking with Helen Summers. The young woman's posture was stiff, her face set in that same unreadable expression she had worn the night before. Her body language betrayed a kind of tension, something that hadn't been there during the party. Miss Marple noted the way Helen's eyes avoided the constable's gaze as he spoke. It was time to act. Miss Marple had learned over the years that the simplest way to uncover the truth was often through a direct confrontation. People who believed they had the upper hand, who thought they could hide behind lies and facades, were often the ones who slipped up when they were put on the spot. Miss Marple had seen this before, and she was ready to see it again. She approached the constable and Helen, her presence unsettlingly calm. "Ah, Miss Marple," the constable said, his face flushed, as if he had been caught off guard. We were just having a little chat about last night's events. Helen straightened at the mention of the conversation, her eyes flicking toward Miss Marple with a barely perceptible shift of emotion. Miss Marple, ever aware of these small details, couldn't help but notice the slight tension in the young woman's movements. There was something she was holding back, something she wasn't saying. "I see," Miss Marple said softly, her gaze drifting from the constable to Helen. "I've been thinking about what happened last night, and I've come to a conclusion. You see, the truth often lies in the small things that we overlook, the things we assume are insignificant." Helen shifted uncomfortably at the words, but Miss Marple's attention was focused entirely on the young woman. "For instance," Miss Marple continued, her tone light but firm, "the way you've been acting this morning. You seem quite calm. Almost a calm for someone who's just lost a friend, don't you think?" Helen opened her mouth to speak, but then seemed to hesitate, her gaze flickering toward the constable for a brief moment. Miss Marple's words had hit a nerve, and it was clear that the young woman didn't know how to respond. Was in moments like this that Miss Marple knew she had struck gold. People who had something to hide often stumbled over their words when confronted directly. "I don't understand what you mean," Helen said finally, her voice steady but betraying a hint of unease. "I'm shocked, of course. I just... I don't know what to say. It's all so sudden." Miss Marple smiled softly, her gaze never leaving the young woman's face. "You don't have to say anything, Helen, but I do wonder if you've been honest with us. You see, I'm not the only one who's noticed your reaction. I suspect others have too." Helen's expression faltered, and she seemed to shift uncomfortably in place. Miss Marple took a small step forward, her voice lowering just enough to be heard only by Helen. "I saw you last night, standing at the edge of the crowd, barely reacting to Margaret's death," Miss Marple said, her words calm but carrying weight. "And today, you seem more concerned with defending your actions than with showing any true sorrow. It's a curious thing, don't you think?" Helen's eyes darted nervously, and Miss Marple saw the flash of guilt cross her face. But just as quickly, the young woman regained her composure, her eyes hardening into something cold and distant. "I'm just trying to process everything," Helen said, her voice now clipped, almost dismissive. "I don't see why that should concern you." "Perhaps it doesn't," Miss Marple replied smoothly. "But I do wonder if you and Margaret's death are connected in ways you haven't been honest about. If you truly cared for her, you wouldn't be hiding something, would you?" The briefest of moments, Miss Marple saw the mask slip. Helen's expression tightened, her lips pressing together in a thin line as she looked at the older woman. She opened her mouth to speak, but then hesitated, clearly struggling to maintain her composure. Helen began, but her voice caught in her throat. She glanced quickly at the constable, as if seeking reassurance, before turning back to Miss Marple. The constable, sensing the growing tension, cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should all just take a moment to calm down. There's no need for accusations. We're all just trying to figure out what happened." Miss Marple turned her gaze to the constable, her eyes softening slightly. "Of course, constable, but I believe Helen has something she wishes to tell us. Don't you, Helen?" The young woman stiffened but said nothing. The constable, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken, stepped back, his hands held up in a gesture of placation. "All right," Miss Marple said, her voice cutting through the tension. "If no one has anything else to add, I'll leave you both to your business. But do remember, secrets have a way of coming to light when we least expect them." With that, Miss Marple turned and walked away, leaving Helen and the constable standing behind her. She left the garden. The weight of the confrontation lingered in the air. Miss Marple had not received any confessions, not yet, but she had planted a seed of doubt in Helen's mind. And that, she knew, was often the first step toward the truth. She walked slowly toward the small gate at the edge of the garden, her mind already working. There was something in Helen's reaction that still bothered her, but she couldn't quite place it yet. Its pieces were almost there, but not quite. It was only a matter of time before she put it all together. As she left the garden, Miss Marple's thoughts turned back to Mrs. Darby. Her role in this mystery was not yet clear. Miss Marple was sure that the older woman knew far more than she had let on. It would take some time, but Miss Marple was patient. Kay would continue to observe, continue to ask the right questions, and soon enough, the truth would reveal itself. The game was still afoot. Chapter 04. The Days That Followed. Margaret Claiborne's tragic death seemed to stretch on forever. The atmosphere in the village of St. Mary Mead had changed. There was no longer the gentle hum of daily life that had once defined the village. Instead, a lingering sense of unease hung in the air like a thick fog, clouding every conversation, every glance exchanged between the villagers. The murder or whatever it had become the topic of every discussion. The unspoken truth behind every door. Miss Marple had spent the last few days speaking to the villagers, observing their reactions and watching their every move with her quiet, sharp eyes, while the constable, still struggling to maintain control of the investigation, split it between interviews and inspections. Miss Marple had focused on what was truly important, the subtle clues hidden in human behavior, the secret lives each of the villagers were trying to protect. It had not been easy to make headway. Most of the villagers had remained tight-lipped, each giving polite but vague responses when questioned, teased, but it was the smallest of interactions, the barely visible shifts in expression that Miss Marple relied on to peel back the layers of deceit. And as she had suspected from the start, there was something darker beneath the surface of St. Mary Mead. Her thoughts turned back to Helen Summers, whom she had confronted a few days earlier. The young woman's reaction to her questions had been telling, but Miss Marple had not been able to extract a full confession or even a clear admission of guilt. Helen had simply closed off, retreating into herself and becoming more distant as the days passed. But there was something about the way she acted, something about her guarded demeanor that spoke volumes. Miss Marple was certain Helen knew more than she was letting on, and she was beginning to suspect that Helen's involvement in the crime was not as innocent as she had claimed. But it was not only Helen who had caught Miss Marple's attention. Mrs. Darby, the ever-composed hostess of the garden party, remained a puzzle that Miss Marple had not yet solved. Her behavior had been odd from the beginning to controlled, to rehearsed, as if she were trying to bury something beneath layers of polite civility. She had made a great show of her grief, of course, but Miss Marple had seen the way Mrs. Darby's eyes had shifted when the conversation turned to the details of Margaret's death. There had been a fleeting moment of panic in her gaze, as if she feared something would slip, something she couldn't control. And there were others, two of the villagers who had known Margaret. Miss Cutts had been eager to dismiss the incident as an accident, but her hasty conclusions made Miss Marple suspicious. The Reverend Beecham, while outwardly calm, had been watching the events unfold with a level of detachment that did not seem natural for a man of the cloth. His eyes had flickered nervously when questioned about Margaret's life, and his lips had pressed into a thin line whenever the subject of the well came up. It was as if he were hiding something, a piece of the puzzle that no one else had yet noticed. Despite all of this, Miss Marple knew that the answer was closer than it seemed. She could feel it in the air, a tension that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. Everyone had their secrets, and soon one of them would crack. But just as she felt herself closing in on the truth, another twist unexpected, unsettling, shook the foundation of her investigation. It was late one afternoon when she received the news. Constable had called her to the village hall, where he was preparing to make a public announcement about the investigation. There had been a new development, something that could change everything. Miss Marple arrived at the village hall and made her way through the small crowd of villagers gathered in the main room. The constable, standing at the front, looked harried and out of sorts. His usual confidence was nowhere to be found. "Miss Marple," he greeted her as she entered, his voice tight. "You'd better come inside. We've found something that may change the entire course of the investigation." Miss Marple nodded, but said nothing as she followed him into the room. The constable stood beside a table where a pile of papers and files were stacked. There was a manila envelope on top, its contents clearly marked. Miss Marple could sense the weight of the situation in the air. "What is it?" she asked, her voice calm but filled with a sense of urgency. "Last night, we received a statement from a villager," the constable began, his eyes darting nervously between Miss Marple and the crowd that had gathered. "A new witness came forward, someone who says they saw something the night of Margaret's death, and what they've told us is..." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "It changes everything." Miss Marple waited patiently as the constable cleared his throat and opened the envelope, pulling out a piece of paper. "This witness claims to have seen someone leaving the area near the well just after Margaret's death, and they recognize that person." The room went silent. Marple stepped closer, her attention sharpening. The constable hesitated for a moment before continuing. "They said they saw Reverend Beecham near the well just after it happened, alone and walking quickly away from the scene." The words hit Miss Marple like a bolt of lightning. Reverend Beecham, the man of the cloth. Her mind raced. She had suspected the Reverend of hiding something, but this was something entirely different. She had seen him acting strangely in the days following Margaret's death, but she had not anticipated that he might be directly involved in her demise. "Are you certain of this witness's statement?" Miss Marple asked, her voice steady but urgent. "How can we be sure they're telling the truth?" The constable shifted uncomfortably. "We verified the witness's identity, and their statement matches up with the timeline. We've also confirmed that Reverend Beecham was seen leaving the area around the time Margaret's body was discovered. But there's more." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "What more?" The constable hesitated, then leaned in closer. "The witness claims that when they saw Beecham, he was holding something in his hand. It looked like a small object, something shiny." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. The locket, the very one she had found by the well. Her mind spun as she tried to piece it all together. Reverend Beecham, known for his pious nature and composure, was now at the center of everything. If he was connected to Margaret's death, it would explain the secrecy, the nervousness, the hidden clues she had observed in the past few days. But there was still so much to uncover, so much that Miss Marple hadn't yet seen. "We must act quickly," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but with a note of finality. "Reverend Beecham's involvement changes everything, but we must be careful how we proceed. We don't want to startle him." The constable nodded. "I agree, but now that we have this new information, we can no longer ignore the possibility that the Reverend was involved. It's time we brought him in for questioning." Miss Marple nodded, but inside, her mind was already racing ahead. She could feel the pieces of the puzzle coming together, the truth rising to the surface. This was only the beginning of the unraveling, ChatGPT said. The days following the revelation about Reverend Beecham had been charged with tension. The village, once so serene, now seemed on edge, the air thick with suspicion. Whispers swirled in every corner of St. Mary Mead, and each day brought with it new rumors, new accusations, but no concrete answers. The constable, flustered and unsure, had begun the process of bringing Reverend Beecham in for questioning. But there was a clear sense of hesitation in the way the investigation was unfolding. Miss Marple had watched carefully from the sidelines, her mind working as always. She had been at the forefront of this case from the very beginning. And while the discovery of Reverend Beecham's involvement had been a breakthrough, Miss Marple knew the real work had only just begun. Still too many unanswered questions, too many gaps in the story for the case to be considered solved. And as much as the villagers believed the Reverend was the culprit, Miss Marple was certain there was more to this story than met the eye. The constable's office had become the focal point for much of the investigation. It was there, in the cramped room filled with files and papers, that Miss Marple was called one morning to meet with the constable. He had arranged a session of questioning with Reverend Beecham, and Miss Marple had insisted on being present. After all, it was her own intuition that had set the stage for this moment. She could not allow the constable to rush in without careful consideration. Miss Marple sat in the back of the office, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes scanning the room. The constable, his round face drawn with worry, paced nervously back and forth. The Reverend, who had been summoned to the station, was due to arrive any moment. Miss Marple had already carefully observed him from afar in the past few days, noting the small but telling signs of stress that had marked his behavior. She knew, deep down, that he was not as calm as he appeared. When the door to the office finally opened, Miss Marple didn't need to look up to know who had entered. Reverend Beecham stood just inside, his broad shoulders stiff with tension. He looked every bit the part of the holy man, the calm, dignified priest who had given his life to the service of the Lord. But Miss Marple had seen through that mask. There was a storm raging beneath the Reverend's composed exterior, and she was determined to draw it out. "Ah, Reverend," Miss Marple greeted him with a smile, her voice soft and polite. "It's so kind of you to join us today." Beecham's face twitched, though he quickly masked the reaction with a tight smile. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low and controlled, "I'm sure you must be just as eager to put this unfortunate matter behind us. I, too, hope we can put an end to this misunderstanding." The constable gave Miss Marple a sidelong glance, but she gave him a reassuring nod. He had been wary of allowing Miss Marple to take the lead, but after everything that had happened, he had come to trust her judgment. The Reverend may have been a respected figure in the village, but Miss Marple knew that the truth often lay in the places people least expected it. "Please, Reverend, sit down," Miss Marple said, gesturing toward the chair across from her. "We've all been so unsettled by the events of the past few days. It's truly a tragedy, isn't it?" Beecham sat stiffly, his hands folded on his lap. "Indeed, Miss Marple, it's a most tragic accident, one that I can't seem to shake from my mind. I was close to Margaret, as you know. We had many conversations over the years, and I'm deeply saddened by her passing." Miss Marple studied him carefully, her gaze unwavering. "I'm sure you are," she said slowly. "And yet, Reverend, there's something that doesn't quite add up. You see, a witness has come forward with new information. They saw you leaving the area near the well shortly after Margaret's body was discovered. You were seen walking away from the scene, holding something shiny in your hand." Beecham's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. "I was near the well, yes," he replied, his voice smooth, but with an edge of defensiveness. "I had come to the garden to pray for Margaret's soul. The shock of the news drove me to seek solace in the familiar surroundings of the church grounds. I had no idea Margaret had died, until I was informed of it. So I was in the garden, walking alone, and naturally, I was upset. But this witness, Miss Marple, I believe they are mistaken." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving the Reverend's face. "I understand, Reverend, I do. And yet, we know you were holding something shiny. Perhaps a locket." Beecham's face froze, and for just a moment, Miss Marple could see the flicker of surprise in his eyes. He quickly regained his composure, but it was too late. Miss Marple had already seen enough. "I don't know what you're implying," he said, his voice growing colder. "A locket? I have no idea what you're referring to." "You're certain of that, Reverend? Miss Marple asked, her voice taking on a soft, almost conversational tone. Because, you see, I found a locket myself. T was near just outside the garden. It seems to me that it's more than just a coincidence that the object you were seen holding matches the one I have found. But I suppose you'll tell me it's all a misunderstanding. Beecham's face shifted, and for a brief moment, Miss Marple could see the mask slip. His eyes widened ever so slightly, and his hands twitched in his lap. Okay, the revelation had struck him harder than he had anticipated. Beecham stammered, but quickly regained his composure. I don't know what you're trying to do, Miss Marple. I am a man of the cloth. I have served my parish for many years. You cannot accuse me of such things without evidence. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. Oh, I'm not accusing you, Reverend. Not yet, anyway. But you must understand that this locket, which I found near the well, is an important clue. And if you were near the well that night, holding something shiny, well, it doesn't take much to connect the dots, does it? There was a long, tense silence. Reverend Beecham looked away, his eyes shifting to the window, his fingers nervously gripping the arm of his chair. Miss Marple's words had left their mark, and now the truth, which had been carefully hidden beneath layers of piety and respectability, was starting to crack. I don't know what you're talking about, Beecham said finally, his voice strained. I've already told you I had nothing to do with Margaret's death. I am innocent. Miss Marple studied him for a moment longer, her gaze calculating. Then she smiled gently, almost as if to herself. I'm sure you are, Reverend, but, you see, it's not just about what you said, it's about what you haven't said, and the truth. Well, the truth always has a way of coming to light. Miss Marple rose slowly from her seat, her eyes never leaving Beecham's face. I think we're done for now, Reverend, but we'll speak again soon. I'm sure of that. With that, Miss Marple turned and walked out of the room, leaving the Reverend to stew in the silence of his own thoughts. She had set the trap, and now it was only a matter of time before he gave in to the pressure. The pieces were finally coming together. The game was nearing its end. ChatGPT said, Chapter 05. The village of St. Mary Mead had not returned to its old, easy rhythm. The tension that had permeated the air after Margaret Claiborne's death still lingered, a heavy, invisible weight that made every conversation feel like an interrogation. For the past several days, Miss Marple had watched the villagers carefully, listening to the gossip, serving the little details that others might overlook. And though the constable had been eager to wrap up the investigation with the conclusion that Reverend Beecham was involved, Miss Marple knew there was more to this story, something deeper, something that the Reverend himself was trying to hide. The constable, meanwhile, had been growing more frustrated by the day. He had tried to press the Reverend, but the man was calm and composed, never once slipping. Still, Miss Marple's instincts told her that something was off, and she could feel the pieces of the puzzle starting to click together. It wasn't just the Reverend's nervous behavior or the locket that had been found near the well. There was something more subtle at place, something that had eluded everyone. Tifa, even the most observant of eyes. Miss Marple had spent the better part of the day in the village, taking note of everything that had happened. She had listened to the conversations that echoed through the streets, watched the way the villagers moved, how they avoided eye contact when the subject of Margaret's death came up. But one conversation in particular had stood out. It had been overheard by chance, a conversation Miss Marple had not intended to hear, but one that would be crucial to solving the case. She had been walking past the village green when she heard the voices, low but unmistakable. Reverend Beecham and Miss Cutts were speaking in hushed tones near the fountain, away from the others. At first, Miss Marple had intended to pass by without making herself known, but the words she overheard stopped her dead in her tracks. I told you. I didn't want to do it. The Reverend's voice was strained, almost pleading. She wouldn't. Stop asking questions, Lavinia. You know what she was like? Always poking around. She had to be silenced. Miss Cutts's response was a murmur that Miss Marple could barely catch, but the implication was clear. Reverend Beecham was not just involved in the death of Margaret, he had actively played a role in it. You should have left it alone, Miss Cutts replied, her voice tight with anxiety. Now, look what you've done. It's not just about her anymore. It's about us. It's about keeping everything quiet and quiet. There was a pause, and Miss Marple could almost feel the weight of the silence between them when Beecham spoke again. His words were colder, filled with resignation. There was no other way, he said. If she hadn't been removed from the picture, the truth would have come out. And everything I've worked for, everything we've worked for, have been exposed. The conversation ended there, and Miss Marple quickly stepped back into the shadows, her heart racing. She had heard enough. The pieces were finally falling into place. Margaret's death was not an accident, not even close. It had been a calculated decision, one made by Reverend Beecham and his willing accomplice. Miss Cutts, Miss Marple knew now that Reverend Beecham was not just the man he appeared to be. He had something to hide, something far darker than anyone in the village had ever suspected. The revelation about Miss Cutts's involvement was a final piece of the puzzle. A detail Miss Marple hadn't expected, but now saw as central to the story. She wasted no time in returning to the constable's office, her mind working quickly to piece together everything she had learned. The time had come to confront the truth. As she entered the office, the constable looked up from his desk, his face tired but still hopeful that the case would soon be closed. Miss Marple, what brings you here? It's clearly expecting more speculation or advice. I believe it's time we wrap up this investigation. Constable, Miss Marple replied, her voice steady but filled with a quiet intensity. I have all the information we need to uncover the truth. The constable raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by her sudden confidence. You've found something then? Miss Marple nodded. Yes, I have. I believe it's time we speak to Reverend Beecham and Miss Cutts. The truth, I'm afraid, is far darker than either of them would like to admit. What do you mean? The constable asked, his curiosity piqued. He had never seen Miss Marple so assured, so certain. There's no easy way to say this, but Reverend Beecham and Miss Cutts are both involved in Margaret's death, Miss Marple said quietly, her eyes never leaving his. It wasn't an accident. It was murder, plain and simple. The constable blinked, clearly taken aback. But the Reverend and Miss Cutts, I don't understand. Miss Marple gave a small, knowing smile. I overheard a conversation this afternoon, Constable. A conversation between Reverend Beecham and Miss Cutts. They were discussing Margaret's death in terms that made it clear he was the one who killed her, and Miss Cutts was complicit in it. She helped him cover it up. The constable looked utterly stunned. You're certain? I am, Miss Marple replied, her voice firm. Reverend Beecham had Margaret silenced because she was getting too close to the truth. She was asking the wrong questions, questioning things she shouldn't have been. As for Miss Cutts, she was in it to protect herself. She had a lot to lose if Margaret's suspicions had become public. The constable rubbed his face, his thoughts clearly racing. But why? Why would they kill her? What was it that Margaret knew? Miss Marple paused, letting the question hang in the air for a moment. I believe Margaret had uncovered something that could have exposed both of them. But they weren't just worried about Margaret. They were worried about the truth coming to light, about their carefully constructed lives unraveling. Where does that leave us now? The constable asked, a sense of urgency creeping into his voice. We need to bring them in, Miss Marple said. It's time to end the charade. The constable stood and immediately made his way to the door. I'll get them in. we'll go right now." Miss Marple followed him to the door, but just before they left the office, she paused. "One more thing, Constable." He turned back to her. "What is it?" Miss Marple's gaze softened. "Reverend Beecham's not the only one with a secret. Miss Cutts is more involved than she's letting on. You might want to pay close attention to her when you speak to them." With that, they left the office and set out to confront the culprits. Miss Marple knew the truth would soon be exposed. Nothing could remain hidden for long in a small village like St. Mary Mead. The final chapter of the mystery was about to unfold, and Miss Marple would be there, as always, to see it through to the end. ChatGPT said. The air in St. Mary Mead was thick with anticipation. The village, usually so quiet and composed, felt tense, as if it were holding its breath. Miss Marple, ever. The observer noted how the villagers moved with subtle unease, casting furtive glances at one another as they went about their routines. They had seen the constable and his officers gather, and word of the impending confrontation had spread like wildfire. The entire village seemed to be on edge, waiting for the truth to finally surface. The constable's office was bustling with activity as the officers prepared to arrest Reverend Beecham and Miss Cutts. Miss Marple stood at the edge of the room, watching the flurry of activity with quiet satisfaction. She had been instrumental in guiding the investigation to this point. And now, with the final confrontation on the horizon, she could feel the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. The constable, his face flushed with determination, was busy making arrangements for the arrests. "We'll bring them in separately," he muttered to himself, his voice tight with urgency. No need to give them the chance to coordinate their stories. Miss Marple nodded, but her mind was already focused on the confrontation ahead. She had no doubt that Reverend Beecham and Miss Cutts would put up a fight. They had worked hard to cover their tracks, to bury the truth beneath layers of lies and deceit. But Miss Marple was certain that the truth would win out. It always did. "I'll go with you," Miss Marple said quietly, breaking the constable's concentration. He looked up at her, his expression a mixture of surprise and gratitude. "You're sure, Miss Marple?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. "It might get messy, I'm sure," she replied, her gaze steady. "I've been a part of this investigation from the beginning, and I'm not about to let it end without seeing it through." Okay. Constable hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Very well. Let's go." The officers piled into the constable's car, and Miss Marple joined them, her mind racing with the possibilities. She had spent so many days watching, listening, and observing. Now it was time for action. It's time to confront the two individuals who had orchestrated Margaret's death, to unmask the lies they had woven so carefully. As they drove through the village, Miss Marple watched the familiar sights flash by: the old stone buildings, the winding lanes, the quiet streets. But today, everything felt different. There was a sense of finality in the air, as though the village was bracing itself for a storm. Okay, and perhaps, in a way, it was. They arrived at Reverend Beecham's residence, first modest but stately building, on the outskirts of the village. The windows were drawn, and the door was locked. It seemed as if the Reverend had been expecting this moment. The constable stepped out of the car first, his hand on the handle of his baton, his expression hardening as he approached the door. "Stay close," he said quietly, looking back at Miss Marple. "We don't know what we're walking into." Miss Marple nodded, her face calm but resolute. She had seen men like Beecham before, men who cloaked themselves in righteousness and power, who used their status to manipulate others. She had no intention of letting him escape justice, no matter how much he tried to hide behind his faith. The constable knocked firmly on the door. It creaked open. Reverend Beecham stood in the doorway, his face pale but composed. His eyes flickered between the constable and Miss Marple, his lips tightening as he realized the gravity of the situation. "Good afternoon, Reverend," the constable said, his voice cold. "I'm afraid we need to speak with you." Beecham's eyes narrowed, but he remained silent, stepping aside to allow them in. "What is this about, Constable?" he asked, his voice low, almost mocking. "I have done nothing wrong. We'll be the judge of that." The constable replied curtly, stepping into the house with Miss Marple following close behind. The interior was neat, with heavy, dark furniture and shelves lined with religious texts. It was the kind of place that exuded authority and control. Everything was in its place except for the subtle tension that clung to the air, a tension that seemed to emanate from Beecham himself. "I'm sure you've heard by now that we've discovered new information about Margaret's death," the constable continued. "And I'm afraid, Reverend, that we've come to the conclusion that you are involved." Becoming increasingly defensive, Reverend Beecham's face hardened. "This is preposterous. You have no evidence, no proof that I had anything to do with Margaret's death." The constable stepped forward, his voice firm. "We know you were seen near the well the night Margaret died. We know you were holding something shiny, and we believe that something to be a locket that belonged to Margaret. And now we have a witness who has confirmed it." Beecham's lips tightened further. "That's absurd," he said, though his voice wavered ever so slightly. "I was praying in the garden. I was distraught when I heard the news. Had nothing to do with her death." Miss Marple's gaze remained fixed on him, her mind sharp and clear. "You're lying, Reverend. I overheard your conversation with Miss Cutts. You were both involved in Margaret's death. You killed her to protect your secrets, your position in the village." Beecham's face paled, and for a moment the mask slipped. He looked at Miss Marple as if she had struck him physically, the realization dawning in his eyes that his secrets were no longer safe. "You have no idea what you're saying," he snapped, his voice rising. "You don't know what it was. Like Margaret was dangerous. She was going to expose me. All of it, my past, my sins. I couldn't let that happen." Miss Marple's expression softened, but her voice was steady and unwavering. "And so, you silenced her. You took her life to protect your own." Beecham's shoulders sagged as the weight of his guilt began to settle over him. He dropped his head, his hands trembling at his sides. "I never meant for it to go this far," he whispered, his voice breaking. "But I couldn't let her destroy everything I had built. It was the only way." The constable moved forward, pulling out a set of handcuffs. "You're under arrest, Reverend, for the murder of Margaret Claiborne." Beecham didn't resist. As the constable placed the handcuffs on his wrists, Miss Marple felt a sense of finality settle over her. The mystery was solved. The truth had come to light, and justice would be served. But even as she stood there, watching the Reverend being led away, Miss Marple's thoughts remained focused. The truth was always hidden in the most unexpected places, and it was only through careful observation, patience, and a willingness to confront the uncomfortable truths that one could ever hope to uncover it. As the door closed behind the Reverend, Miss Marple turned to the constable. "There's one more thing," she said softly. The constable raised an eyebrow. "What's that, Miss Cutts?" Miss Marple replied, her voice low. She knew more than she let on. "We're not done yet." And with that, Miss Marple knew her work was far from finished. The village might have its answers, but there were still questions that needed to be asked, questions that only Miss Cutts could answer. ChatGPT said. Chapter 6. The village had begun to settle into its uneasy calm, the whispers dying down as the arrest of Reverend Beecham dominated the conversation. And as Miss Marple knew all too well, the end of one chapter was rarely the end of the story. Comm's Reverend Beecham's arrest had brought the truth to light, but it was not the full truth. The role of Miss Lavinia Cutts, the quiet, prim, and proper lady of the village, remained an unanswered question. Miss Marple had suspected Miss Cutts from the very beginning, though the woman had played her part so carefully, so convincingly, that it had taken longer than expected for Miss Marple to uncover her involvement. The Reverend had been the obvious culprit, but Miss Cutts's position in the village, her connection to Beecham, and her subtle actions had all pointed to a deeper involvement. She had helped him cover his tracks, no doubt about it, but now, with the Reverend in custody, Miss Cutts's time was running out. It was late afternoon when Miss Marple, having made her way back to her cottage after the constable's office, received the news that Miss Cutts had been located. She had been at home, sitting quietly in her sitting room. But as soon as the constable's man had arrived to question her, she had fled. The sudden disappearance only heightened Miss Marple's resolve. She knew that the woman had been too careful, too measured in her movements to simply vanish without a trace. Miss Cutts's desperation was showing, and Miss Marple was more certain than ever that the final piece of the puzzle was just within reach. The constable's officers had begun a search, but Miss Marple had no intention of waiting for them to catch up. She knew Miss Cutts better than the constable did. The woman would not run far. She was calculating, and everything she did had a reason. Miss Marple's mind worked swiftly, and the answer came to her with the clarity of a bell ringing in the distance. Miss Cutts would head for the one place where she believed she was safe, her house. The constable, still shaken from the events of the day, had agreed to let Miss Marple take the lead. She had proven herself capable of finding the truth where others could not. The constable trusted her instincts, even if they were not always conventional. Miss Marple arrived at Miss Cutts's house on the edge of the village, just as the sun began to set. It was a quiet, picturesque home tucked away behind tall hedges, surrounded by neat flower beds that suggested the perfect balance of order and control that Miss Cutts had always prided herself on. But now, with the house still and the windows dark, it seemed more like a mausoleum than a home. She stepped carefully up the stone path, the crunch of gravel beneath her shoes breaking the silence. Miss Marple had no doubt that Miss Cutts was. Inside, the woman had never been one to make a scene. She would have stayed out of sight, hoping the search would pass her by. But Miss Marple was not here to wait. She was here to finish what she had started. Reaching the front door, Miss Marple knocked 3 times, each knock deliberate and soft. No response. She knocked again, but this time she did not wait. With a quiet push, the door creaked open, revealing the darkened interior. Miss Marple entered without hesitation, her sharp eyes immediately taking in every detail of the entryway. The place was immaculate, as always, with every chair in its proper place, every lamp carefully arranged, and the smell of lavender lingering in the air. Miss Cutts. Miss Marple called softly, her voice carrying through the house. She knew. The woman could hear her. "I'm afraid it's time we had a conversation." There was a brief silence, followed by the soft sound of footsteps. Miss Marple turned to see Miss Cutts emerging from the shadows of the hallway, her face pale but composed. The woman's posture was perfect, as always, but there was an air of tension around her, a nervousness that Miss Marple had never seen before. "Miss Marple," Miss Cutts said, her voice tight, though she tried to maintain her usual poise. "What brings you here? Surely you don't believe I have anything more to add to this investigation?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "Oh, I think you do, Miss Cutts. I think you have quite a bit to add." The older woman stiffened, her lips, Pressing, together in a thin line. "I don't know what you mean. I've already said everything I know, been truthful, as I always am. Miss Marple stepped closer, her eyes never leaving Miss Cutts's face. "That's where you're wrong, Miss Cutts. You've been truthful, yes, but you've left out the most important part of the story. You've been hiding your involvement in Margaret's death. I know you helped Reverend Beecham cover it up." For a moment, Miss Cutts said nothing. Her face tightened, and Miss Marple saw the smallest flicker of panic in her eyes. Then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by the carefully composed mask that Miss Marple had come to know so well. "You're mistaken," Miss Cutts said sharply, her voice growing cold. "I had nothing to do with Margaret's death. I'm not a murderer, Miss Marple." Miss Marple's expression softened, but her voice remained firm. "You didn't kill Margaret, no, but you did help cover up the truth. You and Reverend Beecham both had something to lose: your comfortable lives, your secrets. Margaret was a threat to that, and you couldn't let her ruin everything." Scott's shoulders sagged slightly, but she did not break down. Instead, she straightened her back, lifting her chin with defiance. "You're wrong. I didn't want this to happen. I never meant for Margaret to die. She was. It's difficult, always asking questions, always pushing, but I never thought it would go this far." Miss Marple tilted her head. "But you still helped. You still allowed it to happen." Scott's gaze faltered for a moment, her eyes shifting as though searching for a way out. Then, with a deep sigh, she spoke again, her voice lower, almost resigned. "I did what I had to do," she said, her tone filled with an odd mixture of guilt and justification. "Reverend Beecham and I were ... close. He came to me for help. He was terrified of what Margaret had uncovered. He said she was going to ruin everything, that she would expose him. I didn't know what to do, so I helped him cover it up. I didn't think it would go this far. I thought we could just scare her, intimidate her into silence. But Margaret... she wouldn't stop. She wouldn't back down. And in the end, it was too much for Reverend Beecham. He did it, Miss Marple. Not me, but I knew. I knew, and I didn't stop him." Miss Marple studied her quietly, taking in the older woman's confession. There was no remorse in her words, only a chilling acceptance of her role in the events. Miss Cutts had been a willing accomplice, driven by fear, yes, but also by a deep-seated desire to protect her own position and her secrets. In her mind, the end had justified the means. But now, the truth had caught up with her, and there was nowhere left to hide. "You'll be arrested for your part in this, Miss Cutts," Miss Marple said softly, her voice almost compassionate. "But it's not too late for you to do the right thing. You can tell the full truth now. You can help us bring everything into the light." Miss Cutts looked at her for a long moment, her face conflicted. And then, with a final, weary sigh, she nodded. "You're right. I helped him. And now, I'll help you." Miss Marple nodded once, her heart heavy with the knowledge that the full truth was finally coming to light. As Miss Cutts slowly walked toward the door to surrender, Miss Marple couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet satisfaction. The pieces were all in place now. The mystery had been unraveled, and justice, however long it had taken, would finally be served. The storm that had plagued the village was over, but the echoes of its wake would last long after the truth had been revealed. Tools, ChatGPT, can make mistakes. Check important info. The village of St. Mary Mead slowly began to return to its familiar, quiet rhythm after the shocking revelations surrounding the death of Margaret Claiborne. The arrest of Reverend Beecham and Miss Cutts had caused a stir in the small community, but as the days passed, the initial shock began to wear off, replaced by a growing sense of unease. The village was forever changed, and though the truth had come to light, the lingering questions about what had truly transpired still haunted its inhabitants. Miss Marple, having played her part in unraveling the mystery, had once again retreated into the background. She had been instrumental in uncovering the secrets of Reverend Beecham and Miss Cutts, but she had no desire for the village to turn its focus toward her. She preferred to watch from the sidelines, letting others carry the weight of the drama while she observed the final ripples of the case play out. The constable, to his credit, had done everything in his power to ensure that the investigation was thorough. The charges against Reverend Beecham and Miss Cutts had been brought forward. The village had been given the closure it needed, but Miss Marple knew that there was still a deeper truth lurking beneath the surface, one that could not be easily dismissed. She had spent the past few days walking the village, visiting familiar faces, and listening to the lingering gossip that had taken root in the wake of the events. The villagers, though they were eager to move on, still looked over their shoulders as if expecting another revelation, another twist to the tale. It was a quiet, almost imperceptible shift in the fabric of St. Mary Mead, but it was there, an undercurrent of uncertainty, of fear, and of doubt, as she sat in her small cottage one evening, the faint glow of the setting sun casting long shadows. Through the window, Miss Marple reflected on the events that had transpired. She had never been one to chase after glory or recognition. For her, the satisfaction came from seeing the truth unfold, from watching as the hidden layers of deception were peeled back to reveal the heart of the matter. Margaret Claiborne's death had shaken the village to its core, but it had also exposed something deeper, something Miss Marple had known all along. The quiet, peaceful village that appeared so serene on the surface was built upon a foundation of secrets, teeth beneath the polished veneer of propriety and order. There were lives filled with lies, jealousy, and fear. And while the truth about Margaret's death had been uncovered, Miss Marple knew that many of the darker truths remained hidden, buried deep within the hearts of the villagers. She had spent years in St. Mary Mead, observing the quiet interactions, the whispered conversations, and the subtle gestures that revealed far more than words ever could. She had watched as people tried to maintain their facades, pretending to be something they were not, hiding their deepest fears and desires behind carefully constructed masks. And though she had seen it all, Miss Marple knew that the true nature of people could never be fully understood. It was a puzzle that no one could completely solve. The arrest of Reverend Beecham and Miss Cutts had provided some measure of justice for Margaret, but Miss Marple could not help but wonder how many others in the village were hiding similar secrets, waiting for the right moment to be exposed. She had seen how quickly people could be consumed by their own guilt, how the weight of their actions could bend even the most composed individuals to the breaking point. As she sipped her tea, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the constable, who had shown great determination throughout the investigation. He had been reluctant to trust her at first, but over the course of the case, he had come to rely on her insights. She had always known that he had potential, but it had taken this case to bring it out of him. She smiled softly to herself, proud of the progress he had made, but there was still much work to be done. The investigation may have come to a close, but the true consequences of Margaret's death were still being felt in the village. The constable would need time to process everything that had happened and rebuild the trust of the villagers. Miss Marple knew it would not be easy, but she also knew that the village would eventually move on, as it always did. The next day, Miss Marple found herself walking through the village square once more, observing the quiet bustle of everyday life. The shops had opened as usual, the children played in the streets, and the villagers went about their business as though the events of the past week had never occurred, But there was a subtle shift in the air, a lingering unease that couldn't be shaken off so easily. As she passed by the church, Miss Marple paused for a moment, her gaze resting on the old stone building. Reverend Beecham's absence was palpable, though it would take time for the village to fully comprehend the implications of his actions. The church, once a place of comfort and solace, now felt like a hollowed-out shell, sanctity tainted by the Reverend's betrayal. Miss Marple had always believed that the truth had a way of finding its place in the world, no matter how deeply it was buried. But she also knew that some truths were harder to accept than others. The villagers of St. Mary Mead would have to come to terms with the fact that their beloved Reverend had been capable of murder. It would not be an easy task, but Miss Marple had faith that, in time, they would move past it. As she continued her walk through the village, she caught sight of Miss Cutts walking alone near the edge of the green. The older woman's face was drawn, her eyes vacant as she moved slowly toward her home. there was no joy in her step, no sense of relief now that the truth had come out. Miss Cutts was a woman who had lost everything: her reputation, her place in the village, and the life she had worked so hard to build. Miss Marple felt a pang of sympathy for her, but it was a sympathy tempered by the knowledge that Miss Cutts's actions had led to someone's death. There could be no forgiveness for that. Miss Marple did not approach her. Instead, she stood for a moment, watching the woman disappear into the distance. She knew that Miss Cutts would have to face the consequences of her actions, just as Reverend Beecham would. The law would take care of the rest. But Miss Marple knew that the true cost of their crimes would be something much more personal. Guilt, after all, was not easily forgotten. As Miss Marple made her way back to her cottage, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The mystery had been solved, the perpetrators brought to justice, and the village would eventually heal. But the real victory, as always, was in the process. The careful observation, the patient gathering of information, and the quiet determination to uncover the truth. These were the tools that had brought her to this moment. And though the case was over, Miss Marple knew that there would always be another mystery, another secret to unravel. For now, though, she was content. She had done her part, and the village of St. Mary Mead could finally breathe a little easier. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, Miss Marple smiled to herself, knowing that there would always be more work to do. The world was full of secrets, and Miss Marple would always be there to uncover them. ChatGPT said, Chapter 7. The days following the revelation of Reverend Beecham and Miss Cutts's involvement in Margaret's death were marked by a strange sense of finality, though the village of St. Mary Mead was far from at peace. While justice had been served, the quiet village, so used to its rhythms and routines, now seemed to be suspended in a state of limbo, waiting for something or, perhaps, someone to break the silence. The events of the past few weeks had shattered the illusion of harmony, and Miss Marple knew better than most that the remnants of such a disturbance were never easily forgotten. Miss Marple had spent the last few days in relative solitude, enjoying the quiet of her small cottage at the edge of the village. She had not sought out company, preferring to reflect on the case and its outcome in the silence that only solitude could provide. The village, it seemed, had returned to its routine, albeit with a slightly nervous energy. The villagers had spoken their piece, and now they went about their lives with the barest hint of wariness in their eyes, as if each one were waiting for another shoe to drop. The constable, though relieved by the resolution of the case, was still struggling with the aftermath of the investigation. He had done his best to follow through with the arrests and had been diligent in his work, but Miss Marple could see the toll it had taken on him. His confidence had been shaken, and it would take time before the village fully trusted him again. People who had once looked to him for guidance now regarded him with quiet suspicion. Wondering how much he had missed along the way, Miss Marple understood that such things took time. She knew that even the most competent of men could falter, and that those who worked in the shadows of small villages were never entirely free of judgment. But the constable had learned something valuable through this case: how to look beneath the surface and question what others accepted as truth. It would be a long road ahead, but Miss Marple had no doubt that he would rise to the occasion. It was in this quiet period, when the winds of change had not yet settled and the echoes of the past still clung to the village, that Miss Marple found herself drawn once again into the web of secrets that always seemed to circle St. Mary Mead. On a particularly crisp afternoon, with the sun tipping low in the sky, Miss Marple took her usual walk through the village, her keen eyes scanning the surroundings for the smallest of details that others might miss. The village had settled into its routine, but it had not yet fully healed from the shock. She passed by the church where Reverend Beecham had once stood in front of his congregation, a beacon of piety and authority. Now, The building seemed somehow hollow, its once immaculate walls seeming almost to sigh under the weight of the secrets it had housed. Miss Marple stopped in front of the church for a moment, letting the stillness of the afternoon seep into her bones. The wind carried with it the scent of wood smoke and the faintest trace of the lingering autumn air. The leaves on the trees were beginning to turn, signaling that winter was approaching. She couldn't help but feel that winter, in some ways, had already arrived in St. Mary Mead, not in the chill of the air, but in the quiet gloom that had settled over the village after the events of the past weeks. It was as though the darkness of the truth had seeped into the hearts of its people, leaving behind an uneasy silence. It was then that she heard a soft rustle of footsteps behind her. She turned just as the constable approached, his face lined with the tiredness that had come from days of unresolved worry. His eyes brightened when he saw Miss Marple, though there was still a shadow of doubt behind them, as if he were waiting for something, perhaps an acknowledgement, or perhaps a simple answer to the questions that had been plaguing him. "Miss Marple," the constable said, nodding in greeting. "I've been hoping to catch you." Miss Marple gave him a small smile, her eyes thoughtful. "I'm surprised to see you, Constable. I thought you'd be busy with the final reports and the paperwork." He grimaced. "I wish it were that simple. There's been something strange going on. After the arrests, there were still things left hanging in the air. The villagers are still talking, especially those close to Miss Cutts. I'm not sure they believe the case is really closed." Miss Marple's smile faded slightly, and she turned to face him fully. "What do you mean? You've done all that could be done. Reverend Beecham and Miss Cutts are in custody. The truth has come to light." The constable sighed, rubbing his brow in frustration. "Yes, but I can't shake the feeling that we're missing something important. The arrest of Miss Cutts was a step forward, but I'm not convinced that the village is ready to move on, not without everyone's acting." Miss Marple studied him for a moment, her brow furrowing slightly. "What exactly is bothering you?" It's the way the village is responding to the news," he said quietly, glancing around, as if to make sure no one else was listening. "There's an odd tension in the air. It's like they're waiting for something else to happen. And then there's the fact that Miss Cutts has been unusually quiet about the whole thing. She hasn't tried to defend herself, not in the way I'd expect someone who was innocent. I think she's hiding something else, something deeper." Miss Marple nodded, the pieces falling into place in her mind. "I suspected as much. Miss Cutts may have been caught, but there's still more to uncover. The truth may be more complex than even she realizes." The constable looked at her sharply. "Do you think there's more to this? I thought you were confident we had everything." "I was, but there are always nuances that don't immediately come to light. The village is restless because they can sense that the full story hasn't been told." Miss Marple replied, her voice low, her eyes narrowing with understanding. "Miss Cutts isn't the type to leave things unfinished. She will have kept something from you, perhaps in the hope that it would protect her, or perhaps in the hope that it would protect someone else." The constable shook his head, his frustration mounting. "But why? What else could there be? We know the basics. Margaret was killed. The Reverend and Miss Cutts tried to cover it up. What could possibly be left to uncover?" Miss Marple looked at him thoughtfully, then turned toward the village square, with the busy chatter of afternoon. Life continued around them. "It's times, Constable. The truth is hidden in the way people react to what's been revealed. There's more to Miss Cutts' story than she's letting on, and if we pay close attention, we might just find out what it is." The constable followed her gaze, and after a long pause, he nodded. "I'll keep an eye on her, Miss Marple. I've been so focused on the Reverend that I didn't realize I might be overlooking something else." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I'm sure you'll find it. But it's not just about what's hid. It's about the patterns that people create when they try to protect themselves. Pay attention to the little things." With that, Miss Marple began to walk away, the quiet village settling back into its rhythm around her. The constable, though still uncertain, watched her go, knowing that Miss Marple was never wrong. If she suspected that something was being hidden, then it was only a matter of time before the truth would come to light. As Miss Marple made her way down the cobbled streets, the familiar village landscape before her, she knew that this story was not yet finished. Well, there was still more to uncover, more threads to pull at. St. Mary Mead had its secrets, and though some had been revealed, there was always the promise of more beneath the surface. And Miss Marple, as always, was ready to dig deeper, to dig deeper. The days stretched on in St. Mary Mead, and though life seemed to settle back into its usual routine, there was an undercurrent of tension that refused to dissipate. The village had weathered the shock of Margaret Claiborne's death, the arrests of Reverend Beecham and Miss Cutts, but the atmosphere still felt fractured, as if the very fabric of the village had been torn and hastily mended. Miss Marple continued her quiet observations from the periphery, watching as the constable worked tirelessly to restore order to the village. His confidence had been shaken, but he was trying to rebuild it piece by piece. Miss Cutts's arrest had provided some closure, but the village was far from at peace. There were still lingering questions that could not be ignored. The villagers, as always, were tight-lipped, but the air around them seemed to crackle with an unspoken sense of disquiet. Miss Marple had noticed that something was different about Miss Cutts's behavior since her arrest. The woman, once so composed and unyielding, had seemed broken, her defenses lowered, and her silence had become more conspicuous. She hadn't tried to justify her actions or protest her innocence, as most would. Instead, she had withdrawn further into herself, and it had become clear to Miss Marple that the woman was hiding something deeper. But what was it? The constable, in his usual thorough manner, had interrogated Miss Cutts multiple times, trying to get her to reveal more, but the woman remained firm in her silence, despite the apparent guilt that now stained her every word and action. Miss Cutts had refused to offer any further details, any explanation of why she had helped the Reverend. What was her real involvement? What had she not yet shared? Miss Marple's curiosity had been piqued ever since she had heard her whisper during the earlier confrontation with Reverend Beecham. The fragmented pieces of their conversation hadn't fully explained the mystery, and Miss Marple knew that if Miss Cutts truly understood something vital, it was only a matter of time before it came to light. One afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the village square. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the cobbled streets. There was a slight chill in the air, a sign of the approaching fall, and the wind carried the scent of damp earth and dried leaves. She passed by a few familiar faces, each one avoiding her gaze as though they could feel her attention on them, even from a distance. People who once greeted her with friendly nods now looked away, distracted by their own thoughts, as if they could sense the invisible weight of the truth that hung between them all. She passed the church, the place where Reverend Beecham had once stood, the center of his small world. The church had always been the heart of the village, but now it felt more like a tombstone than a sanctuary. Just as she was about to turn down a quiet lane, Miss Marple spotted a familiar figure standing by the garden gate of Miss Cutts's house. It was the constable, standing with his arms crossed, looking toward the door as though he were waiting for someone. Miss Marple had seen him out and about often these days, but today, something about his demeanor seemed different, more purposeful, yet tinged with frustration. "Good afternoon, Constable," Miss Marple greeted, her voice soft but firm. The constable turned quickly, as if startled by her sudden appearance, then gave her a tight smile. "Ah, Miss Marple, I didn't expect to see you out here today. I was just thinking. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with curiosity. "About what, exactly?" The constable rubbed the back of his neck, looking a bit uncomfortable. "I've been trying to get Miss Cutts to talk, but she's as tight-lipped as ever. I've asked her everything, but she's not giving anything away. I'm beginning to think we've missed something crucial." "Perhaps she hasn't missed it," Miss Marple said, her voice almost a whisper, her eyes thoughtful. "Perhaps it's you who have missed something." The constable looked puzzled, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple's gaze shifted toward the house, and she took a few steps closer. "People always think they've seen everything. That's the trouble. They see what's in front of them, and they assume that's all there is. But there's always something more, something deeper." "Are you saying I haven't been thorough?" The constable sounded defensive, though he immediately regretted the tone of his voice. He had always admired Miss Marple's sharp instincts, but this case was wearing him thin, and he was not yet sure of his next move. "No, not at all," Miss Marple replied gently. "You've been very thorough, but sometimes it's the smallest things that make the difference. I wonder if you've been focusing too much on the obvious and not enough on the details that others might have missed." The constable, still unsure, turned to look at Miss Cutts' house, his expression conflicted. "I don't know, Miss Marple. I feel like we've exhausted every angle. She just ... keeps saying the same things. It's almost like she's too ... calm about everything." "Exactly," Miss Marple said, her voice low with understanding. "Sometimes the most obvious clues are hidden behind the things that don't add up. And Miss Cutts' calmness ... it's not natural. Not for someone who has been involved in something as serious as this. She's hiding something else, Constable. Something we haven't seen yet." The constable looked at her, his eyes sharpening. "You think she knows more than she's letting on?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, and I think she's waiting for the right moment to reveal it. She's playing a game, Constable, and we need to make sure we understand the rules before we confront her again." The constable took a deep breath, the weight of Miss Marple's words sinking in. He had been so focused on the reverend, on the obvious connections, that he had failed to see the deeper layer of Miss Cutts' involvement. He had underestimated her, and in doing so, he had overlooked the most important clues. Miss Marple smiled softly, almost as if to herself. "Now, I believe it's time we revisit Miss Cutts. But this time, Constable, we do it with a new perspective. We'll go slowly, carefully. We'll pay attention to every detail, no matter how small." The constable nodded, his resolve hardening. "All right, Miss Marple, let's do it." Together, they walked toward Miss Cutts' house, the village still and silent around them, as though holding its breath for what was to come. The house stood like a monument to the past, its perfectly manicured garden and tidy facade hiding the chaos and lies within. Miss Cutts had been caught in her web of deceit, but she was far from finished. Tate, the real truth, whatever it was, still lay hidden, waiting to be unearthed. Miss Marple stopped at the door and turned to the constable. "Remember, Constable, it's not just about what she says. It's about what she doesn't say and how she reacts to our questions. We've been too focused on her guiltlets. Focus on the details instead. They'll reveal everything in the end." The constable gave a quick nod. "I understand, Miss Marple." Miss Marple knocked softly on the door. They were about to uncover what Miss Cutts had been hiding, that ChatGPT said. The door to Miss Cutts' house opened slowly, creaking on its hinges, as though the building itself was reluctant to reveal what was inside. Miss Marple stood at the threshold, her expression calm and composed, as she waited for the woman who had, for so long, lived behind a facade of propriety and order. There had been a time when Miss Cutts' image of the perfect, respectable villager had been above reproach. But now, after all that had transpired, that image was shattered. The truth, however deeply buried, was coming to light. Miss Cutts appeared. In the doorway, her face pale, eyes clouded with a mix of resignation and unease. She looked smaller than Miss Marple had remembered, as though the weight of recent events had drained her of her usual confidence. She seemed to shrink back as Miss Marple stepped into the house, her eyes flickering nervously between the constable and the older woman. "Good afternoon, Miss Cutts," Miss Marple said with a polite nod. Her voice steady, but tinged with something far more serious beneath the surface. "We've come to speak with you about a few more details regarding Margaret's death." Miss Cutts's lips pressed together into a thin line. Her posture stiffened, but she did not retreat. "I've already said everything I know," she said, her voice cool, but with an underlying edge of tension. "I don't see why this is necessary. The matter has been settled. Reverend Beecham and I, we are in custody, and the truth is out." Miss Marple studied her carefully, noticing how Miss Cutts's eyes darted toward the small table in the corner of the room. The room was tidy as ever, the furniture arranged with perfect symmetry. Yet there was an air of discomfort that permeated the space, a space that Miss Cutts had once controlled with such ease. "I agree that much has been revealed, Miss Cutts," Miss Marple said, her gaze fixed on the woman in front of her. "But I also know that there is more you have yet to tell. There's more to this story than just the Reverend's involvement, and you've been holding something back." At the mention of Reverend Beecham, Miss Cutts's hand twitched, though she quickly masked the movement. Her composure faltered for just a moment, but it was enough for Miss Marple to see that her earlier assumptions were correct. Miss Cutts had not been entirely forthcoming. "I don't know what you mean," Miss Cutts replied quickly, her voice tight. "I've already explained everything. I've admitted to helping Reverend Beecham cover up the death pod. All there was to it. There's nothing more." Miss Marple's lips curled into a faint smile, but her eyes remained sharp and unwavering. "No, Miss Cutts, you're still not telling us everything. You've been hiding something far more personal than you're willing to admit." The room grew silent for a moment, the only sound the soft ticking of the clock on the mantel. Miss Cutts stood rigid, her breath shallow, and Miss Marple could see the flicker of guilt in her eyes. The older woman was trying to hold on to her composure, but it was slipping. She was fighting something that had been gnawing at her for far longer than Miss Marple had anticipated. "I don't know what you're implying." "Miss Marple," Miss Cutts said after a long pause, her voice barely above a whisper, "I've told you everything I know. I was scared. Yes, that doesn't mean I was involved in Margaret's death. I didn't do it, Reverend Beecham." Miss Marple raised a hand, cutting her off. "I never said you did it, Miss Cutts, but you know more than you've let on. You've been protecting someone in the village who has been involved in far more than just the Reverend's fear of exposure." Cutts's eyes widened for a brief moment, and in that instant, Miss Marple knew she had hit a nerve. The guilt was there, clear as day, but there was more. Miss Cutts was hiding something even deeper. The question, Miss Marple realized, wasn't just what had happened with Marguerite, was what Miss Cutts had been protecting. Who was she really protecting? I don't know what you're talking about," Miss Cutts stammered, her hands wringing in front of her. "I've been through enough already. You don't understand. I was just trying to help. I couldn't let the Reverend's life be destroyed." Miss Marple stepped closer, her voice soft but unwavering. "Miss Cutts, there is someone else, isn't there? Someone you've been hiding. Someone whose involvement in Margaret's death is even more significant than you're willing to admit." Miss Cutts's eyes flickered with something that Miss Marple couldn't quite place. It was a moment of hesitation, a split second of realization, before the woman's face hardened once more, her gaze turning cold. "You're wrong," she said, her voice now flat, devoid of emotion. "There's no one else. The Reverend and we made a mistake, but it wasn't as bad as you think. Kid, it was bad enough to ruin someone's life, Miss Cutts," Miss Marple replied quietly. "You're not telling us the full story." You're hiding something, someone. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Scott's fingers trembled, but she remained silent. Miss Marple could feel the woman's resistance, but she could also sense that the walls were beginning to crumble. Do you know, Miss Cutts, that your refusal to speak the whole truth is making things worse for you? Miss Marple asked gently. I understand your desire to protect someone, but protecting someone who has committed a crime, especially murder, does no one any favors. The air in the room seemed to thicken, and Miss Cutts took an unsteady step back, as if physically distancing herself from the conversation. Miss Marple could see the struggle in her eyes. She wanted to say something, wanted to break, but something was holding her back. Tell me, Miss Cutts, Miss Marple said softly, who are you really protecting, and why? Who else is involved in this tragedy? The woman's shoulders slumped, and for the first time, Miss Marple saw the full weight of her guilt, her fear, and her regret. Her voice cracked as she spoke, barely above a whisper. I didn't want to be involved in any of this, Miss Cutts began, her words rushing out in a torrent. But it wasn't just the Reverend. It was a man, someone in the village, someone who had more to lose than we could imagine. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. Who was it? Miss Cutts closed her eyes, her hand pressed to her mouth, as though she could somehow suppress the words that were threatening to spill out. It was Mr. Liddell, she said, her voice trembling. I never meant for it to go this far, but he, he pushed us to do it. He said if we didn't help him, everything would fall apart. He was the one who had more to lose than anyone he had, connections. Okay. And when Margaret found out, he couldn't let her ruin it all. He, he made us do it. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her mind working quickly. Mr. Liddell, she repeated softly, her mind racing. The solicitor. Miss Cutts nodded, her face pale, her body trembling. Yes, he's the one who pulled the strings. He had been involved with Margaret, and when she started asking too many questions, he couldn't let her expose him, so he used the Reverend and me to cover it up. The room was still for a moment as the weight of Miss Cutts's confession sank in. Miss Marple stood motionless, processing the revelation. Mr. Liddell, the quiet, respected solicitor of the village, had orchestrated it all. The quiet man with a spotless reputation, the one who had seemed beyond reproach. He was the true mastermind. Miss Marple felt a chill run down her spine. The pieces were finally coming together, and with Mr. Liddell's involvement, this case had just become far more dangerous than she had imagined. The true extent of the web they had all been caught in was now revealed, and it was far from finished.